Hi. Thanks a lot, David, for being here again. This is really great. We can talk a little more about the uh, sweeping the homeless, which you touched on the last time. It's a very controversial issue. Some constitutional concerns have been raised, and some um, concerns about criminalizing the homeless, and also, well, uh, those two, and you mentioned yesterday that there should be a more effective alternative. So if you would talk a little about that today, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, the sweep is basically when the government, local government comes in and disbands a camp and often seizes the possessions of people in that camp. Often they'll say, well, we're going to store these, and you can come and get them at a certain place, but that often doesn't happen because the people in question do not have a means of getting to where it's being stored. But in any case, what happens is often people lose their property. And the ACLU has emphasized that aspect of sweeps as being unconstitutional because it constitutes an illegal seizure and destruction of property. The sweeps, though, are happen in many different communities, and here in Portland, they're certainly very common. And they're quite popular in the neighborhoods. In my neighborhood, for example, where there are a number of camps and so on, and vehicles, people living in vehicles, whenever that happens, whenever there's a sweep, people, the housed community cheers. And we just had one this last week where some people were taken. But what happens, of course, is that people just come back. Maybe not the same people, but and sometimes it is the same people. And so it's ineffective in terms of what it sets out to do. But as I say, it has a lot of support among the housed folks. Under the Martin versus Boise decision by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals back in 2018, it was determined that a city or a government cannot ban camping, cannot criminalize camping unless they have an alternative that enough shelter space to accommodate everybody who's on the streets. And that has been very difficult because the cities have a hard time establishing enough shelter space. And then often there'll be congregate shelters that a lot of people on the streets do not like, and for good reason. They're frequently unsafe and unhealthy sorts of places. So it's really a conundrum for the cities. And of course, it's really difficult for those who are on the street who don't have a place to live. So that is a challenge that we have here in Portland. A couple of different alternatives have been sort of mooted. One is a Safe Rest Village, where they would be established camps with tiny houses and services. And there were 2 years ago, or maybe it's even as long ago as 3 years ago, they set out to do 6 of these camps. There are 2 of them operating at this time. It runs into all kinds of problems because a lot of neighborhoods don't want that kind of camp in the neighborhood. So they had a lot of trouble securing sites. They also have some difficulty securing nonprofits that will manage the camp. So that's one thing. There are a couple of them operating, and it has some promise, but as I say, it's very difficult. The other option that has been mooted by our mayor is to create large camps, tent camps, and to then ban camping in the city and tell everyone who's out on the street that they have to go to one of these camps, which would have, initially they were saying 500 people. Now they're saying it could be, the camp would accommodate 150 people, which I'm really kind of skeptical about whether this will work or not. but that's what they're trying to do. They have established one of these camps so far. I don't know if it's actually populated with 150 people or not yet, but that's operating. A third possibility, which a friend of mine is really in favor of, is to create what he calls pop-up shelters in churches and other public and buildings, where it would just be a shelter overnight. People would go there. They would not be on the street, but they would have a place to stay at night. And they'd be smaller groups, smaller settings. There are a couple of churches have agreed to do this so far, but many more would have to do it if it were to be effective. The Portland Central Church of the Nazarene has agreed to do that, but they have a lot of property for historical reasons, and they have created one of the tiny house communities there for people. But it's a very difficult, challenging situation. A lot of there are people on the streets who, for one reason or another, have decided that that's what they want, which is kind of strange. I feel like that can't be true, but that you talk to people, sometimes they'll tell you that they prefer to be out on the streets and so on. But most people who are on the streets would I think embrace an opportunity to get off and move on to it.
Yeah. Sure.
There's a lot happening. That the legislature just passed another large allocation of something like $200 million to address issues both upstream and downstream. The upstream solutions are to try to work to avoid evictions, to help people who are facing eviction to find resources to, particularly if it's a question of not having the rent. Now, there are other evictions that would stand, but if it's simply a matter of people not having the rent, the state would provide resources. And they've done that. They did that during the pandemic, the worst of the pandemic. And there's the Tri-County area in Portland, which is Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington counties. Voters passed a bill back just before the pandemic started, which imposed a small tax on high-income earners to fund supportive housing. And that's rolling out now. That gives resources for drug addiction treatment, mental health services, and so on, in conjunction with housing that's being created. But housing takes a long time to get started, and we're not going to build ourselves out of this problem anytime soon. So we're faced with a lot of intermediate kinds of approaches, like safe rest villages and pop-up shelters and things like that.
Well, thank you, David. I appreciate that. I want to keep this to a length where we'll get an audience.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I really appreciate your presentation. It's been really well received. So I hope you'll be encouraged and return to speak again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
It's a pleasure. You did. Let's see. You stopped the recording? Well, here, the only thing.
There it is. Oh, no, it's the light's still on. It's blinking. That's weird.
The record button has disappeared.
Yeah, it's still blinking. It's blinking now. I have it up on the left-hand side of my screen and it's blinking.